Well, it's officially 3 o'clock, so I'm going to kind of get rolling. Welcome to the last session and probably the least geeky session of this entire conference. I really appreciate the Scenic City Summit folks kind of fitting me in here today. So I've got a little different perspective. I know most folks here are software development, IT folks. My roots are in telecom. I've spent the last 25 years doing broadband, smart city planning. Chattanooga is my home, but my work has been everywhere except Chattanooga. Most recently working on large-scale projects on the West Coast and some really cool stuff. Building lots of infrastructure, building lots of networks. And for folks that are at all familiar with Chattanooga, you probably know that we are kind of the poster child for that. Chattanooga is the gig city. We've got really, EPB has just done an astounding job of building broadband network. I think we're still like one of two places in the world, along with Berlin, that you can go and buy a 25 gig connection to your home. The Chattanooga is still really just kind of the tip of the iceberg. There's tons of communities across the country that have built broadband networks, and of course big telecom has been kind of doing stuff too. The whole 5G world is really kind of odd and weird, but it's doing some amazing things. If anybody in here is into networking, and particularly wireless networking, I encourage you to look into Open RAN technologies. There's going to be some really interesting opportunities in software development to plug into 5G networks and advanced wireless. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. My thinking about this is we have done this really incredible job of building physical network infrastructure, but what are we building on top of it? That's the bottom of the stack. And EPB and other broadband providers, when you talk to them about it and ask them, well, what are you building on top of it? What's the software infrastructure look like? They kind of just stare at you blankly and say, oh. Matter of fact, I had a broadband advocate at a conference recently with some top folks from around the country. I asked them this question, and who's building the software infrastructure? And he said, I don't like that question. And at that point, I knew I was on to something. So let me start with a couple of questions for you guys. Is software infrastructure?
Depends on the software.
Depends on what the software is. Who else?
Infrastructure is software now.
What's that?
Some infrastructure is software now.
Some infrastructure is software. That's correct, yeah.
Routers are software, really.
What's that?
Routers are specialized computers running software.
Routers
Same
are
with
just
switches,
yep.
APs, all of it.
Right. Any other thoughts? Is software infrastructure? The funny thing about it is it really depends on where you're sitting in the stack, doesn't it? So, when, for example, a lot of folks say, oh, I'm a full stack developer. It's like, well, that means you do front end and back end, right? So that's only about just a third of the actual tech stack. Not even considering, things like I had to deal with, physical, where do you put stuff? Where do you put fiber in the right of way? Where do you put microcells? How do you do building wiring so that you can get access to all this stuff? And of course, a lot of that is being driven by software-defined networks, and related technologies. And of course, from the business perspective, if they have to fool with software, that's a problem. So if we just think of infrastructure in terms of the stuff you don't notice until it breaks, software is definitely infrastructure. It should be infrastructure. If it's not infrastructure, you're probably either a software developer or there's a problem. So the next question then is, if software is infrastructure, at what scale is it infrastructure? And for whom is it infrastructure? So is it infrastructure just for the big corporations, the Unums and larger organizations, or is it infrastructure for small businesses? Is it infrastructure for individuals? What do you guys think?
Absolutely.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I feel like it depends on the degree to which anyone depends on it. So, I mean, you can have, in that in-between time where you had both paper files and, a computer system and there were duplicate records, and
Yep.
maybe it was lightly, but when it's the only kind of...
So it kind of depends on where you are with it and how you're using it, right? Is that accurate? And I think your point about having kind of a situation in which you're dealing with a hybrid system of paper over here and software over here. Has anybody been to a physician's office recently? They've gone totally electronic, right? Yet they still have racks and racks of paper records. And so it really does kind of depend upon how you look at it. And then the other thing that I think is really interesting about it is that if you're looking at individual firms, organizations, right? Software is infrastructure for them, their infrastructure. They don't really own it, they're really leasing it most of the time, buying it, but it's theirs. And you go next door, and the next firm has their infrastructure, and the next firm has their infrastructure. And if you're a network guy like me, you're going, what? Why would you be replicating this infrastructure over and over again? You're replicating costs, you're creating risk because of the way that it's distributed out there, and of course because everybody has a little bit different infrastructure, you have to have different talent pool, and if you're importing that software from Microsoft or Oracle, guess what? You're paying a premium for their talent pool, and so you're not only multiplying costs over and over again, you're paying excessive costs. So I think there's a really interesting set of needs here, one of which is just simply the need for more economical software. And when I say economical, I mean big picture economical, because what we have to remember is oftentimes the costs of software are not just what you're paying in terms of license fees or even support fees. It's the technical debt that you're incurring. It's the management issues that come up because software isn't working right. We can't get our invoices through the system, so our customers are late in paying, and so we're not getting the cash flow, and yada yada. That's all costs that are built into it that make less economical. It's especially, I think, an issue for small businesses, for startup businesses, nonprofit and for-profit, because they have to run so lean these days that they just don't have the resources, the people, to take care of their software. And so they're kind of in a position where they have to buy it, and anybody that's dealt with, for example, Intuit these days and trying to figure out how to do small business bookkeeping will have run head-on into this problem. Anybody that deals with Adobe and their Creative Suite has run head-on into this problem. And then the other issue with the economics of software is just the level of control and the level of ability that you have to take ownership of and capitalize on your own data and avoid getting locked in. So this is another huge cost with our software infrastructure, is once you adopt something, Oracle, SAP, even Microsoft, heck, Google, once you get bought into it, you're stuck with it. And they're going to suck you dry. They're going to milk you like a cash cow. I mean, that's the way a lot of the software industry works these days. And also, have it better aligned with your business goals, with your purpose. This is the thing I'm a huge believer in, is really understanding what your purpose is, why you exist, why customers give you money. This is really an executive role. Matter of fact, I would argue that this is the executive role is to understand, take ownership of customer value and communicate that to everybody else and make sure that everything in your organization is aligned with customer value, in particular your software, but also the talent that supports the software. And that is a huge challenge in and of itself, especially with a lot of the solutions that are out there today that you essentially have to fight with in order to get it to align with your purpose and your customer values. And right along with that is just tools that are more flexible, more adaptable, more sustainable solutions. Because again, if you're locked into it, is that really sustainable? If you're in a position where the industry, the economy, the whole sector is evolving around you and changing faster than your software is, are you in a position that you're at risk? So in the broadband world, billing and operation support software is really critical to everything that broadband providers do. And a lot of the smaller broadband providers have been around for a long time. Guess what? They're bought into the older systems. Now there's new, totally transformative software out there. Guess who's at a competitive disadvantage because they can't evolve into the newer technologies. And then, this really is a huge issue, I think, one that a lot of people kind of feel in their gut. It's kind of there in the background, but just the whole issue of digital sovereignty. I mean, when we're talking about AI, I think one of the biggest issues with that is you're putting your data into a model, a statistical model. And yeah, it's generating content that you can use, but you're also basically building the product for the vendor. And then they're turning around and selling that product with your data. And do you get royalties on that? Do you even know where that's going? Oh yeah, we keep all of your data segmented out, and yeah, we're very careful about that. I believe that as much as I believe that, they're out for our own special interests. And then, of course, the last big piece of this is what we're doing here. And I just really am impressed with this whole conference. It's the first time I've had opportunity to participate in something like this. And again, I'm not really a software developer or anything, but the need to constantly update your capabilities and your skills is a huge challenge. The fact that you can't build these skills by sitting in a classroom, you really have to do it collaboratively, you have to do working hands-on. And beyond that, I really think the critical issue of who is in the talent pool and who is not. So how do we expand the talent pool to bring in more diverse viewpoints? How do we make it deeper so that as we're going over time, that there's more and more people that are coming in, and particularly at the local level, the community level, here in Chattanooga. I'm really, again, just really impressed with this whole event because it tells me that there's a really great pool of talent in Chattanooga, but how are we tapping into you guys? How are we mobilizing you to help with community issues? And then you think, well, how about Cleveland? They're building a broadband network. How about Scottsboro, Alabama? They've had a broadband network for a while. What kind of talent pool do they have to capitalize on that infrastructure? And how do you make sure that that talent pool is expanding, evolving? So I think there's some really critical needs there, but I also think there's some huge opportunities. And the first one is just being able to collaborate at the local level, to be able to cross across industry, sector, even political, generational boundaries, to share knowledge, to work together. I think that's an opportunity that is inherent in communities. That's what communities are all about. But how do you create that context? So, for example, you guys are used to dealing with agile methodologies and all that kind of cool stuff. What about at the community level? what would an agile community look like? One that could really identify issues that need to be addressed and rapidly iterate on solutions, and not only have the folks that are directly impacted by those issues involved in designing the solutions, but have a learning process where community leadership and technologists are learning together about those issues, helping to solve them, and understanding how to replicate those solutions in other areas. So just how do we facilitate collaborative, continuous learning at a community level? The other aspect of this is, kind of a world I'm somewhat unintentionally got involved in. So like I said, I'm not a software developer, but I have been, as an entrepreneur, working on a collaborative workforce planning application, literally for 10 years now. We're slowly, asymptotically approaching a launch. But if I'd done this in San Jose or another tech hotbed, I probably could have had it built in 2 years, probably less. But because I'm in Chattanooga, it's taken a lot longer. Now, one of the things we've been able to tap into to speed that process is open source. So we're using Laravel as our development framework. We're using a lot of other open source technologies built into it. That's been a huge enabler. If we hadn't had that, it would have been, literally impossible. It never would have happened. We never would have gotten this far. And beyond just kind of the open source world, there's a lot of really interesting work that's being done really globally around how do we take a much more open approach to capitalizing on our soft assets. So for example, creating local data commons. Even Google and Microsoft have gotten bought into this, but we got all this data out there. How do we share it securely but openly so that it can be utilized in different ways? A lot of local governments, Chattanooga in particular, have open data portals. That's a great start, but it's still a bit constrained. So how do we make sure that it's out there in a way that is really accessible and usable, and really start to think of our data, our applications, our code base as public goods? How many folks are here familiar with the open source program office concept? So this is something I encourage you guys to look into. It's really pretty fascinating, but it's the idea that within a large entity, especially universities, corporations tend to have them, there is an office, there's a group that owns open source, that they're managing projects, directing resources. There's a lot of just education that goes into it. It's a really powerful concept for facilitating open source, but you know what? It requires substantial resources. So I'm talking to the folks at City of Chattanooga. Yeah, we've done some open source stuff, but it's just so hard to sustain. You get, part of the way through the project, and all of a sudden the folks that built up all the skills and knowledge find a better job and they're gone. So that doesn't really make sense. Well, what if we had a shared open source program office? We're very used to, in the startup world, the idea of fractional CFOs, and even fractional CIOs. What if we had an open source program office that anyone in the community that wants to do something with open source technology can tap into? It's really a pretty well developed practice area. The Linux Foundation has a whole division that's around open source program offices. So kind of how do we adapt that? And within that is kind of this idea of having sponsors for programs, so that you can not only just have one entity that's saying, we want this software, we need something special developed, but I'm going to bring in other folks that have similar needs. So if you're not familiar with the Open Infrastructure Foundation, I encourage you guys to look into that. Really interesting organization. They kind of own Kubernetes. They own some other major kind of hyperscale open source stuff. And that's the way they work. Is you've got some aspect of your operations that you need open source solutions for. You don't have to just totally take it on yourself. You can bring in others to work with you, and Open Infrastructure Foundation will lead that effort and figure out how to make it work. The other interesting opportunity, I think, is essentially an economic opportunity. So if you're having similar needs, similar opportunities across multiple organizations, and you can bring them together to say, hey, here's something we need to develop. We are tired of Intuit taking us to the cleaners. We want to adopt open source small business accounting software. That's something that would be really tough for any individual small business to do. But you get 10, 20, 100 small businesses all together that say, we all want to do this. All of a sudden, not only does it become practical, it becomes an economic opportunity because they're all saying, we all need this, basically aggregating all this demand. Well, who's going to take care of it? How do we broker it out so that others can take it on and knock it out? So shifting gears a little bit, let me ask you guys, what do you think? Is leadership important for technology? What role would you say leadership plays in technology?
Well, I mean, in any field, but especially in technology, I guess what systems you use, how your team is set up, how efficient your work is,
Right.
lots of things about what are the expectations, is there an environment for collaboration, in some situations you would want to disagree with your leadership, some situations you would. It's kind of the key to a lot of things, hopefully. If you have bad leaders, they're going to make you do stupid things, essentially.
So not to put words in your mouth, but just kind of summarizing, the leadership structures the situation that we have to work in. And if leadership doesn't understand technology, if they're just not very competent, they create dysfunctional structures, and it's really hard to get good return on technology investment in those kind of situations, right? Mm-hmm. Other thoughts on how leadership is important with technology? Yeah.
If you're I guess I don't know about straight up leadership. I mean, if you're a one-man band, for instance, you kind of de facto are, your own payroll, your own HR, your own leadership, that kind of thing.
Right.
But maybe it's not so much about these specific people and what direction they feel it should go. Their job should be more about governance. To your point of this is the frame that we're operating in, and this is why, and you let loose some talent to go and operate in that frame.
So in terms of governance, so if you're saying if you're an individual, basically developer, because no man is an island in these days and age, especially you got to have customers, you got to have vendors, supporters. So when you say governance, you mean kind of creating a framework for saying, your work is good or your work is crap and we need to fix it.
Right. I mean, this concept, if the goal is to share, this collaboration, right?
Right.
Person who's paying for all the collaboration stuff isn't paying the bills, that's governance, right?
Yep. Right. Yeah.
I guess my question would be how you're defining leadership, because
Right.
I feel like there are self-led teams in a lot of ways, which means that yes, your own leadership with yourself or whatever you're working on, if you have the vision, that you're able to kind of guide it, right? But then if we're talking about a larger structure, I think at the individual level, it's more important to have the ability to work collaboratively versus being able to necessarily guide everybody or have people follow you as a leader.
So kind of, again, not to put words in your mouth, but as you're working as an individual in a team, there's a level of leadership that's about keeping collaboration going. But then there's another level of leadership about basically setting goals and making sure folks are getting results.
I think there can be, but I don't think there has to be.
Right. Other thoughts? So to me, one of the interesting things about leadership and technology is that technology transforms leadership as much as leadership determines how the technology is deployed. So the leadership of Google is very different than the leadership of GM. And as a company is deploying technology in order to change the way it operates, the leadership has to change along with it. Not only the way they structure the work, but their very mindset. And again, the key to this is focus on customer value and really getting inside the customer's head to understand what really drives them and makes them want to spend money, and then communicating that to your organization. If you are just a command and control leader and you're saying, here's how you must do it and here's what we must get out of this, as the technology changes, you're going to fail. But if you're a leader that's saying, here's what we need to do to make the customers delighted, what piece of it can you take ownership of, and structuring the situation so that individuals and teams can contribute to that and communicate to you how they're contributing to that so you can communicate it back to the customer, you're creating a situation in which folks can go out there and say, here's some new technology, here's something really cool that we can try out, and let's go through a process to learn about it. If we're going to fail, let's fail fast, break some things, take it over again, and that's a very different form of leadership. So, do you think leaders understand technology? Do you think they should understand technology?
Yes.
Yes. I heard several folks say yes. Do they need to know the difference between C# and C+?
Probably. It depends what kind of leader they are.
If their product is maybe built on those, they probably should have some understanding.
Yeah, because of what the company is and what they're selling and what have you.
See, because the challenge with a lot of leaders is they're driven by things like, bottom line cost structure and how are we making sure that we're recognizing revenue as we're booking it. And they have a tendency, because software is infrastructure, to ignore it until it breaks.
I think, but I would disagree. I would say that's more of a manager than it is a leader.
Mm-hmm.
The leader was more of a visionary, like Steve Jobs, whereas somebody who's like a CEO cares
Right.
about the next goal, getting numbers. We need to make layoffs so I can get my bonus.
Right.
That's a totally different type of mindset.
Totally different kind of. So there's the visionary leadership, and then there's the transactional
Yeah,
leadership that, right?
And an important role of leadership in technology. You asked earlier, does leadership shape technology? Yes, it can.
Mm-hmm.
You need, sometimes, a leader is somebody who has walked a mile in somebody's shoes. It
Exactly.
would be the older person, the mentor, that
Mhm.
shapes the younger generation.
Right.
A good story is the story of how Oculus got created. So in the 80s, Nintendo, I believe, they tried to create a VR headset, and it
Mhm.
failed miserably because it hurt people's eyes because the
Yeah.
graphics were not good enough,
Mm-hmm.
and it caused vision problems. They came up with lawsuits and filed, and the whole thing crashed and burned. And VR wasn't talked about for 30 plus years.
Right.
And the person who created Oculus, he was really into the idea of VR and getting into that. And so he started just, researching it, talking to like-minded folks. And he actually met, through an online forum, he met the founder of Doom, which you wouldn't think the creator of the game Doom would have any interest, but he was inspired by the creator of Oculus's vision. He actually kind of bankrolled him, and they ended up founding Oculus. And now, fast forward today, this is probably mid-2010s, and now you have you've got EO everywhere. So they brought that back to life, but again, you had to have the vision. You had to have, so that was a visionary kind of leadership. And the Doom person, he had that, he saw the vision, and he agreed with it as well, and he also was able to be kind of the mentor, because he'd been a seasoned business person. So in some ways, really, yes, you do need leaders in tech, and yes, and for good tech, you need to have good leaders, not managers.
Yes, so for good tech, you need to have good leaders, not just managers.
Yeah.
I'd argue you need to have both, and that really any good manager is a leader. Generally, I'd say the leaders build the systems, to structure the systems that managers have to work within, but the point still applies. And to the extent that, leaders are leading an organization that's very technology oriented, yes, if your product is a technology product, you should probably know that stuff inside out. But if you're a consumer goods company or a service organization, to what extent do you really need to understand the technology? There's a number of different ways to think about it, but the way I would approach it is you need to understand the parts of the technology that are directly related to customer value. And you need to be able to turn to someone that has ownership of a particular area of that technology that can then do a deep dive into it and can help you not only understand how that relates to customer value, but where are the dependencies and what are the contingencies if we're having issues. This is all strategy. This is all relating technology investment back to bottom line costs, back to top line revenue opportunities, and ultimately to the ability to differentiate yourself in the marketplace. And so I think really for me, the key issue that we're dealing with in a lot of society today is a leadership issue, and particularly a technology leadership issue, in which we kind of have this really huge gulf between leaders who are making decisions about how to go to market and how to take care of customers and how to structure their organizations, and the technologists who own the solutions and oftentimes get the problems dumped in their lap because the leaders are making ill-advised decisions. So how do we educate leaders more effectively about technology? I'm sure it is not just sitting them down in a class and teaching, because that is just not going to work. For one thing, most leaders' attention span is about that of a 2-year-old. With all due respect to the executives out there. But one thing I think is we really have to connect it back to customer value. We really have to make a compelling business case of why the technology is important and how it relates. Again, bottom line, this is saving us money. This allows us to reduce the amount of time. This amount allows us to reduce materials. Top line, this allows us to go out there and take care of more customers. It allows us to get into new markets, and really explaining in a way that leaders understand, really defining the level of knowledge. So for example, does a leader need to know the details of their company's tech stack? Or tech stacks, usually, because most companies have numerous tech stacks. No, probably not. But guess how many executive types I've talked to and said, what does your tech stack look like? And they look at me and like, what's a tech stack? So, yeah, you need to understand that your organization has a tech stack and what the general components of it are, what the most critical components are, and where the risk is. If this component goes away, if Broadcom buys up VMware and decides that they are no longer going to support it for anything other than the biggest companies, what are you going to do? That's a pretty big contingency that you need to be prepared for. Does the executive need to understand that? No. Does the CIO need to understand it? Damn sure. And the CIO needs to be able to tell the executive, here's our strategy for dealing with that. And the other thing, I think with a lot of executives, and with anybody when you're talking about educating, is you really have to understand what is their prior knowledge. You know, I got a doctorate in education, and one of the main things I learned, all learning begins with prior knowledge. Wow, damn. You should have just told me that when I started. It would save me a lot of time and money. But really has to be based on interests. It has to be intrinsically motivated. That kind of learning is much more effective, especially with executives, than trying to have extrinsic motivations. You know, that's just not going to work on an executive. They have to say, this is really valuable to me. It's something I'm interested in because I see the value that it brings to me in my business, in my organization. Then I think the other aspect of technology leadership is that there has to be a means of supporting it on an ongoing basis. One of the earliest ways I got into technology leadership and seeing it in action was working at Bell South. Yes, I know I'm old. But we took folks from around the organization and ran them through the different IT aspects of the business to get them acquainted with what was going on and how the technology was used in various instances of business. And fun things like, going back to your point, we've got this old mainframe system that does this, and now we've got this new client server system that does this. They basically do the same thing, but they don't talk to one another, so can't get rid of that one. This one's the new one, so now we've got people doing twice the work, and guess what? Our error rate's gone up, and we've got, it's like, what? Yeah, so I think having a means to coach and provide ongoing support for technology leadership is critical. Yeah.
I have a burning question.
Burning question.
Something that you said earlier, the question of like, is leadership important for tech? I'm curious to know like what you think there, because I thought you were asking specifically like whether tech would benefit from less leadership in general. Like you mentioned open source, so like does like self-oriented tech tend to fare better than like market?
Right.
Right. Sorry.
So you're asking me to provide an answer to that question?
I'm curious if that was like part of that question.
That is part of the question.
Okay.
Yes. So I think the nature of leadership, in particular, kind of the great man and command and control model of leadership, does not fare well in the modern technology era, and it literally kills technology companies and creates huge amounts of technical debt, costs, missed deadlines, etc. So the model of leadership for technology, in order to effectively build strategies and deploy it, almost has to be a catalytic, a servant leadership model, which most leaders and almost no managers are ever trained in. It's, here's the task, do them. Well, couldn't we do this more efficiently? Do not ask questions, do them. Yeah, that's not going to fare well in a technology organization.
Thank you.
And then being able to sustain it over time and enable technology leaders is really important. So, just to wrap up, I'm going to pitch to you guys what we're launching here in Chattanooga. So we're launching an initiative to build community software infrastructure, what I would call a digital utility for the community. There are several reasons for doing this that I've basically kind of summarized as been going along. For one thing, it's about enabling our small businesses, our startups, for-profit, nonprofit, helping them be more successful. That's a really key element of it. One is just to promote open source software, because I've become a really true believer in the power of open source to educate leaders. You know, it's a very different way of thinking about technology investment. You are not buying software. You're not paying license fees. You're not paying ongoing fees. You get the software for free, but you have to invest in the talent. And you can't just invest in your current talent, because you have to assume that as they get upskilled, they're going to find other opportunities and they're going to move on. So you have to invest in the larger talent pool. And you have to invest in the software by contributing upstream to the code base. You have to have ways for folks to access the software and use it. So we got to figure out how to deploy that. And again, particularly for small and medium-sized businesses. And I think most importantly is we have to contribute to the tech talent development. Not only more advanced professionals like all of you guys, but who are the entry level, who are the inspiring technologists, how do we get kids fired up about it, who's out there in the workforce, working age adults that need new opportunities, how do we plug them in to help them develop their technology skills, and going back full circle, how do we engage leadership folks, the folks making decisions about where to find resources and how to allocate them, how do we educate them about technology. The only way to do it is learning by doing, collaboratively in the community. So you're not going to necessarily want to learn this in your organization because of the risks and issues with it. Get engaged with a local nonprofit. We're going to be working with Barking Legs Theater. So let's get leaders engaged with working with performing arts organizations to figure out how we can implement technology that's going to help them be successful. Take those lessons, take them back to your organization. So that's kind of what I'm doing. Looking at how we extend the stack, take it to the next level, build software infrastructure, build the technology talent, and develop our technology leadership at the same time. I think Chattanooga is a wonderful place to do this. It's both a challenge but a huge opportunity for us. I think that if we can do it here in Chattanooga, we've already been seen as a model for a lot of other things. Folks are going to say, hey, look at what Chattanooga's doing. We need to do this here. We can take it around the world. I mean, we can take it up and down the Tennessee Valley. We can take it all over the place. But the cool thing about that is then that generates more opportunities back for folks in Chattanooga, because other communities are saying, hey, how are you doing it? We want to learn from you. So if you guys are interested, greg@eduity.net, shoot me an email, find me on LinkedIn. I'd love to talk with you. Like I said, we're just kind of ramping this up. A lot to figure out. How do we handle the mechanics of it? How do we put teams on different projects? A lot of stuff that's out of my depth, so I'm looking for collaborators. So that's my story. Any other questions or feedback before we wrap up this afternoon?
Is Chattanooga Digital, you said it's an initiative, but is it managed? Is it also an organization?
It is not yet an organization, but that's one of the things we're looking at is how to evolve it into a formal organization. My general thoughts is it needs to be community owned, because I don't want to just, if it's super successful, I don't want it to be acquired. If it isn't successful, I don't want it to just die off. I want it to have some ownership. So I'm thinking it's probably a cooperative model. I'm a big fan of the utility business model. We can have a discussion about why that is. But I think it could work very well with the utility business model. But yeah, that's one of the things we're looking at. Other questions, thoughts? Well, I tell you what, I think I'm finishing up 6 minutes early. So really appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend. Maybe I'll see you at the happy hour.